Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed, and today we'll be continuing our two-part series on the history of the Imperium, starting just after the Horus Heresy, and ending with the time of ending, conveniently. Now, we won't be dealing with the Horus Heresy in these videos, because it is such an expansive area of Warhammer 40,000 lore that we didn't want to deny you any of its content, and thus we will be doing an entire series of videos on the Horus Heresy in its own segment. So, I hope you can wait for all the juicy stuff that exists within there, and we will start this second video with the Great Scouring. Now, the Great Scouring occurred directly after the Horus Heresy, and this was the counter-thrust against the heretics that was made by the Imperial forces. They fought back against this uprising, which had occurred right across the galaxy and had only culminated in the Siege of Terra. But of course, even with Horus dead, there was no end to the amount of heretics that there were out there, and so the Imperium began to push back, having the Emperor, before being interred on the Golden Throne, declare all of them heretics, traitors, and unredeemable. He stated that they should all be pushed back into the Eye of Terror in order to contain them in one small area of the galaxy. Now, it was not a quick thing, the Great Scouring. It lasted 7 years, and that was a time when many wars were fought, many battles won and lost by both sides, and a huge number of people were killed, more than in many areas of the Horus Heresy, in fact. But it was a necessary evil in order for the Imperium to regain the stability it has enjoyed under the Great Crusade. There were several systems and worlds which had not taken the side during the Horus Heresy, believing that it was not their fight. However, now that the heresy was coming to an end, these areas were being punished for their indecision by both the loyalists and the rebels alike. People were becoming more and more afraid of heresy, and even mentioning the traitor legions was becoming punished by grave censure. It was in an effort to completely erase the heretics from history that all knowledge of them was purged, and even today, many of the standard citizens of the Imperium would have no knowledge of these traitor legions ever having existed. Finally, the Chaos legions that had turned against the Emperor were pushed back into the Eye of Terror. But this was not a great victory. The light of the Great Crusade had gone out. All that had been won in the intervening years since the Age of Strife were now under threat of complete and utter loss because of this conflict. There was very little people could do. Their leader was now essentially incommunicado. They couldn't speak to him. He was locked in the Golden Throne. It was in this period that the Age of Rebirth began, and it was all thanks to the Ultramarines Primarch Robert Guilliman. Now, he was one of the primary Primarchs, as he was incredibly intelligent and very well versed in military strategy, and because of him, he was able to marshal his legion, which had not taken part in the Siege of Terra, being held up on the eastern fringes of the galaxy. But because of this, they were now one of the most populous legions in the entirety of the Imperium, and so were able to stand up and defend against the now encroaching Chaos legions and encroaching Xenos beasts that were becoming wise to the fact that humanity was not the power it once was. Because of the Ultramarines, humanity was saved from an ignoble defeat, and thus the Age of Rebirth solidified into what we now know as the Imperium. It was also in this period that the Codex Astartes was drafted, breaking up the original Space Marine legions into many smaller chapters in order to prevent any one man, like the War Master Horus before, from gaining power that no man should wield apart from the Emperor. It was also in this period that a small event that many of you may not know of, called the Beheading, occurred, when the head of the Officio Assassinorium tried to remove the High Lords of Terror and install himself as the ruler of the Imperium. Now, we don't know a huge amount about this, but we do know that a combined Space Marine assault was launched upon the Officio Assassinorium, and although only one Space Marine survived, he was enough to kill the mad assassin and prevent this slowly reforming Imperium from being destroyed right there. After the Great Scouring and the Age of Rebirth came the Forging. Now this is a small period where we don't know much, but we know that the Adeptus Terra was actually formalised in this period, finally coming from its infancy during the Great Crusade into the great bureaucratic organisation that we know today. It allowed the Imperium to gain a sense of stability, and helped them formalise many of the institutions that had become unwieldy and empowered during the Age of Rebirth. Just like during the Great Crusade, there was much external conflict as well as internal conflict, with armies reclaiming worlds and fighting off the Xenos incursions that had started during the Age of Rebirth. After the Forging came a period in the 35th millennium known as the Nova Terra Interregnum. Now, the Nova Terra Interregnum was also known as the time of twin empires, and this was a period that lasted 9 centuries, when the Council of Nova Terra dismissed the authority of the High Lords and claimed the rule of the Segmentum Pacificus for themselves. Now, there's very little that the High Lords could do at this period, because they didn't have the resources to redirect armies from the fronts right back into the Imperium itself, and so allowed this Council to take control until 900 years after the fact. The Ecclesiarchy declared a war of faith in the Imperium and tried to unite the Imperium as a faith-organised body. Now, because of their fervour, they managed to cause an uprising within the Nova Terra Segmentum and caused the overthrow of the Council. After the Nova Terra Interregnum came the Age of Apostasy. Now, the Age of Apostasy is one of the most defining features of the Imperium after the Great Crusades and the Horus Heresy, and it is one of the most strife-filled times since that period that the Imperium has known. It occurred in the early 36th millennium, 5 millennia after the Horus Heresy, and it arose out of a power struggle between the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum. Now, the Ecclesiarchy, as we mentioned briefly earlier, was a rising power in this point. The faith of the God Emperor had been quite weak early on because of its sporadity and its lack of unified belief, but now, because of the Ecclesiarchy, people were becoming unified in their faith in the Emperor. Their faith, in fact, was so powerful they were able to rival the High Lords in their control over the people, and thus the High Lords were actually following the word of the Ecclesiarchy without consulting any others or even themselves. This led to a lot of tension between the Ecclesiarchy and the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Space Marine chapters, as both these factions tended to view the Emperor in their own specific way, which conflicted directly with the Ecclesiarchy's view. Also, they had managed to rile the Administratum in this period. Now, the Administratum had been a very powerful entity during the Age of Rebirth, as it had helped organise the entirety of the Imperium, but now, because of the Ecclesiarchy, they were losing their power. So, the Administratum began essentially a bureaucratic war against the Ecclesiarchy. They began to influence votes and cause the Ecclesiarchy to elect a very vast number of low-powered ecclesiarchs who had very little drive or ambition to keep the Ecclesiarchy in its place. Thus, between the 34th and 35th millennium, the Ecclesiarchy waned in its power and allowed the Administratum to regain its position. Because of this waning of power, the Ecclesiarchy decided to move from Terra to Ophelia 7 in the Segmentum Tempestus. Ophelia 7 was one of the most wealthy worlds in the Imperium next to Mars and Terra, and also was the place where the current Ecclesiarch, Benedin IV, had actually been a cardinal during his rise to power. Now that the Ecclesiarchy were on Ophelia, it became apparent that this was where they were meant to be. The palaces to the Ecclesiarchy were over 90,000 square miles large and soared thousands of metres into the air. They were huge things, rivalled only by the Palace of Terra, and it was something that allowed the Ecclesiarchy to show that it was not defeated and could still be an incredible force. They raised huge tithes to perform massive works of art and massive works of religious ceremonies for the people, and spread across the galaxy, spreading the word to the Emperor with them. However, this spreading of faith actually led to an increase in violence in the Imperium because they perceived a lot more heresy than had been previously apparent due to their, let's say, dogmatic views on the Emperor. They also, in this period, raised a force known as the Fraternis Templars, a zealot army that had a power to rival the Imperial Guard, and a faith that could not be wavered even in the direst of circumstances. Now, nearly 300 years after the ecclesiarchy moved to Orfila 7, they actually moved back to Terra. Now, the current ecclesiarch at the time thought that it was a prudent measure in order to allow the Imperium to see the power of the ecclesiarchy. But it was not without its cost. They had to raise their tithes again, on top of the tithes they had previously raised, causing huge amounts of expense to the people, but allowing them to reclaim their palaces on Terra and reinstitute their power in the Imperium. However, after the ecclesiarchy moved back to Terra, they began to grow, let's say, complacent. They wanted more and more wealth, they wanted more and more power, and so they continued to raise their tithes. They raised them so high, in fact, that the planetary governors, who themselves inflicted a large tax upon the people, were forced to object to this. However, the ecclesiarchy responded to these objections violently. They dispatched the Fraternis Templars to crush any revolt against them, and many high-ranking officers in the Imperium were executed as heretics without any fuss from the High Lords due to their power of the ecclesiarchy. Now, the ecclesiarchy were continuing their rise, but this did not mean that they were able to suppress everything. Uprisings and revolts continued right across the Imperium, and eventually leading to a massive collapse in power through the weight of rebellion. Many dangers befell the Imperium as well during this period. The threat of chaos had not stopped, the threat of the Xenos had not stopped, and so, even whilst the Imperium was beginning to fight amongst itself, not openly of course, but in the subtlest of means, it meant that these incursions by the enemy were getting more and more pervasive, and this great Imperium that had taken 5,000 years to form was under threat from all sides. Of course, on top of all these problems were the warp storms. Just like in the Age of Strife, humanity was now being cut off from the rest of itself by warp storms. Although they're not prevailing as much as they had originally, these massive vortices in the warp were cutting off the Imperium from itself, and there was a very real threat at this point that the Imperium would cease to be. It was in the midst of all this chaos and madness that a new leader rose to the High Lord's seat. A man known as Gorge Vandar, and he is now a name that is cursed alongside Horus because of his action. He rose as the 361st High Lord of the Administratum, and he had a reputation for resisting the dominance of the ecclesiarchy, but he was not a pure man. He had used corruption, he had used assassins, he had used every nefarious means under his command in order to gain his position. And because of this, it gave him a lot of power in the High Lords. He even used his influence to get a weak ecclesiarch known as Paulius III elected to this position of power, and not without reason, as this man was easily controlled by Vandar. Once he had finally taken control of the Administratum, Vandar actually used his power to undermine the ecclesiarchy at every turn, and eventually led a large group of Imperial Guard officers into the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra, and had Paulius III arrested, declaring him a heretic and executing him on the spot. Now Vandar ordered that the ecclesiarchy be purged, and that he himself be appointed as its ecclesiarch, thus gaining control of two of the most powerful organisations within the Imperium. He was an undisputed leader. He was now only beneath the Emperor in power, and so he began his reign, and this reign would become known as the Reign of Blood. As time went by, after Vandar rose as the High Lord of the Administratum and the Ecclesiarch, it became apparent that he was unhinged in quite a severe way. He was a paranoid megalomaniac who saw traitors and conspiracy wherever he went. His mind was incredibly twisted, and he actually enjoyed personally torturing people whenever he could, declaring to the onlookers that I am purging these people of sin, purging them for their own good. His mood was always very unpredictable, and he could actually be very volatile at one moment and then become incredibly peaceful the next. Not knowing what to do, many people found it impossible to be with him for any length of time. He would actually fall into many strange trances now and again, which he'd said were when he received his orders from the Emperor himself. However, this was highly unlikely, and was more likely that he was merely being tormented by his own demons, as usually after these periods of calm he's always struck by bouts of excessive violence, and he had brought many people to their knees in moments after these strange periods. He also had a huge map of the galaxy plotted in his chambers, which was constantly being updated with the known warp storm patterns. And so whenever a world was uncovered by the warp storms, he would instantly send an expeditionary force there to reclaim the world for the Imperium and install himself as the highest authority on the planet. Under his command, many atrocities took place, such as the bombing of the hive world Kalana 7, the invasion of the farmlands of Boraz Minor, where every female child under 12 was enslaved, and he also melted the ice caps of Johanna, where thousands upon thousands died in the encroaching floods that he had caused. But in this period there was also a revelation made when his spies came across a cult known as the Daughters of the Emperor. Now usually Vandai had these cults purged swiftly, because they often did not follow the belief of the ecclesiarchy in which he was the supreme ruler of the Imperium, and thus posed a threat to him. But what he had heard about the Daughters of the Emperor, located on the agri-world of San Lior, intrigued him. They were an order who devoted themselves to the worship of the Emperor through inner purity and external martial capability. And so Vandai believed that he now had a force that he could use if he could convince them to join him. He travelled to San Lior himself, taking with him a massive procession of soldiers, servants, scribes and scholars. This mile-long procession led from the landing fields where his shuttles touched down, right up until the gates of the Daughter of the Emperor's monastery. However, when they arrived at the monastery, they found that the gates were closed, barred and guarded by the sisters of this order. They declared that they did not recognise his authority and would not allow him access. Now, most of his servants realised that this could be a volatile period, but Vandai had expected this and planned accordingly. He said that he would wish to converse with the Emperor inside and the Order's leaders, and thus asked that only himself and several bodyguards be allowed to enter, and the rest of his force would remain outside. They agreed to this small concession, thus allowed Vandai into the monastery. There he went straight to the chapel of the Emperor and knelt down in apparent prayer, asking for him to protect the so-called ecclesiarch against all harm. He then stood, and in front of the entire order of sisters and his bodyguard, asked his chief bodyguard to shoot him in the head with his las pistol. Now, the officer initially refused, but eventually, after many moments, agreed to Vandai's request and shot him in the head. Little known to everyone else was that Vandai was not only protected by his bodyguard, but also a Rosarius, a very powerful piece of technology from the Dark Age of Technology that could resist many forms of danger and violence, including a shot from a las pistol. To outside onlookers, he was enveloped in a golden light, where the las blast simply fizzled and died, allowing him to stand unharmed in front of everyone. The Daughters of the Emperor immediately kneeled down in prayer to him, stating that he was obviously beloved by the Emperor and thus saved from any harm. They took an oath of fealty to him on the spot and became his personal bodyguard. They were trained by the highest orders of the Imperial Guard and also received many weapons and armour modifications that were found only in the Space Marine Legions and the highest ranks of the Imperial Guard. They weren't only his bodyguards, but his companions and servants. They tasted his food, fed him whenever he fell ill, which was regularly, and nursed his frail body, entertaining him with singing, dancing, and other exotic skills that they picked up along the way, despite the fact they were still hardened fighters. For almost 70 years, Vandai continued his reign over the Imperium, allowing his whims to control this vast empire, but doing little to help preserve it. Even on Terra, whole wings of the ecclesiarchal palace fell into disrepair. Dust lay knee-deep in some places, and holy relics were completely obscured by the dirt and grime of centuries. Vandai would retreat, usually, into his chambers and sat in silence for days at a time. He would often fall into long, nightmarish sleeps, which would cause him to cry out in hysterical screams, and also suffered terribly at the hands of time. His body was ancient at this point, and was being pumped full of drugs in order to keep him alive and keep diseases from riddling his body. It was at this period that a young agent arrived from the outer worlds, coming to Terra with fear in his heart, for he had come from a world known as Dim Amar. This world had announced that Vandai was a traitor against humanity, and that one man was there to lead the Imperium into glory again. That was Sebastian Thor. No one at this time knew where Thor had come from. Some suspected him to be a demonic entity, but that was just not the case. He was just a man, born in the Dim Amar Scholar Prognanium. Thor had visions of the Emperor from an early age, and that he had been warned that humanity was falling into a path that it could never get out of. Thor had an eloquence and charisma that enticed many, who came to believe that his message of anti-Vandairism was the right way to go, and it helped redirect much of the anger that had been focused against the governors of the Imperium and onto the man who had perpetrated all the problems. It was at this point that Vandai fell more into himself. Many times he was seen huddled on his velvet throne in his meeting chamber, flanked by the brides of the Emperor and nobody else. Within 3 months of Thor becoming apparent, over 80 planets had fallen to this new Confederation of Light, which resisted Vandai's claims of power and ordered that the Imperium be returned to a state that it had previously existed in. Many of the Fraternist Templars actually prevented other worlds from joining this new Confederation of Light, violently putting down any uprisings that they could find, and relaying their problems back to the ecclesiastical palace on Terra. Soon after this rise of the Confederation of Light, orders came down from the top to engage in a massive purging by the Fraternist Templars of this new Confederation, and ordered a great assemblage of all the ships and all the power that the Templars could bring. They launched a warp jump from their main base at Clax, but did not get any further than that. Moments after entering the warp, they were destroyed by a massive wave of light, according to the last astropathic message, which rendered every ship into small pieces to be fed upon by the demons residing within the warp. Shortly after this point, a warp storm completely covered the area of Clax, and it has become known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath. With the death of this vast fleet, the whole of the Segmentum Obscurus burst into rebellion. Thousands and thousands travelled to hear Thor speak, and the governor of Dim Amar was so impressed by his speaking that they allowed the command of Dim Amar's army to fall to Thor. Many thought that the Segment Obscurus was falling into chaos, but the faithful knew that it was rising up against chaos, and Vandai realised that his schemes were finally coming to an end with the encroachment of Sebastian Thor. There are many tales of Thor's trip to Terra, although none of them have much detail as far as we know. He visited many planets, and everyone he visited joined his cause, worshipping his charisma as an emperor-given gift. Wherever Thor went, the warp was silent, was as quiet as it could have possibly been in that time, and the head of the Navigator's Order actually named him the Master of the Warp, so was his power over this churning phenomenon. Soon, masses moved against Vandai, realising that they had been duped by this old man sitting on his velvet throne. Now, the end of the Reign of Blood was actually not brought about by Thor himself. The Space Marine Legions and the Adeptus Mechanicus had retreated during this period, realising that Vandai's forces could actually do damage to them in a way that would stop the Imperium from ever regenerating. They had become bastions of their old faith, and were protecting people from Vandai's invasions, usually rising up against the Fraternist Templar themselves. Many chapter masters had voiced their praise for the Confederation of Light, realising that this was the true way that the Imperium was meant to be governed, and the Adeptus Mechanicus called for the High Lords to execute Vandai as a traitor. In response, Vandai actually dismissed all of the High Lords and asked his remaining forces to attack the Space Marines, who were now considered revolting against the Imperium. However, all of his commanders refused point blank, and even though he had them executed and burned as heretics and replaced by more loyal army commanders, it was shown that Vandire was no longer the shining beacon of the Emperor, but merely a husk of an old man who was struggling to retain his power. It was at this time that the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus put together a strike force of Tech Guard, along with the Imperial Fists, Firehawks, Soul Drinkers, and Black Templars Space Marines, in order to take the fight to the Ecclesiarchical Palace on Terra itself and remove Vandire by force. Although Vandire had let some of the Ecclesiarchical Palace fall into ruin, a lot of the central chambers were now still very deeply reinforced and were nigh impregnable. Even the largest guns that the Adeptus Mechanicus brought with them could not penetrate the wall to any great degree, and the daughters of the Emperor, who had been renamed as the Brides of the Emperor under Vandire, fought back violently against these usurpers as they perceived them, still faithful to Vandire even after all his corruption and all his heresies. So it looked grim for the assault force, but there was one other force that Vandire had overlooked, and that was the Adeptus Custodes. They had maintained their vigil over the Emperor's mortal remains, but they had actually closed off the palaces of Terra against this war in the Imperium, and had not perceived any of the faults that Vandire had brought to the Imperium since his rise to power. However, the moment that the forces of Space Marines and Adeptus Mechanicus landed and began to broadcast their demands to Vandire, the Adeptus Custodes realised what had occurred. Meeting with the leaders of the Space Marine Strike Force, they realised that they needed to get to Vandire directly and commanded that the Space Marines continued their assault on the Ecclesiarchical Palace. The Adeptus Custodes themselves used the tunnels beneath the walls of Terra in order to get into the palace and get to Vandire directly. However, they were met by more Brides of the Emperor, who were still staunch in their defence. A miniature battle ensued, but the Centurion of the Adeptus Custodes eventually was able to get the leader of the Brides of the Emperor to listen to his reasoning. Although he couldn't reason with her directly, he is thought to have taken her directly to the chamber where the Golden Throne was located, and shown her the truth of the matter, although none of us know how that was done. All that is known is that she returned with her eyes open to Vandire's problems, and thus was part of the battle that then took place to reach Vandire. We do not know the exact blow-by-blow of this battle, but we do know that it was the head of the Brides of the Emperor who personally executed Van on his throne. Officially, the Age of Apostasy ended with the death of Lord Vandire, but the turmoil within the Imperium would last for centuries. Many of the significant events that actually occurred were such as the trial of Sebastian Thor shortly after he arrived at Terra, during which the damage that had been done during the miniature siege had been repaired. Many of the remaining cardinals tried to have Sebastian Thor tried as a traitor to the Imperium, but the majority prevailed and he was actually cleared of all charges, and then later made the Ecclesiarch, which was a rapid reversal of fortune for him. It was also this period where the High Lords, who had been reformed, had forbidden the Ecclesiarchy to ever again maintain a men-at-arms force like the Fraternis Templars. However, the Brides of the Emperor were reformed into the Adeptus Sororitas, aka the Sisters of Battle. This became the military force of the Ecclesiarchy, and got round the whole idea of them having men-at-arms, literally having women-at-arms, although it is not known how this was regulated by the High Lords of Terra. It was also in this period that Thor set up the Synod of Terra, which was actually a group which would regulate the ecclesiarchy themselves and not ever be beholden to a single ecclesiarch ever again, repeating the reformation that had occurred after the Horus Heresy. Now comes the Age of Redemption, after the long Age of Apostasy. It was a time when the Imperium was finally cleared of warp storms, and the Emperor's forces could go out and reclaim the lands that they had lost during the Age of Apostasy. There were many hundreds of crusades called, and the martial forces of the Imperium set out in order to reclaim their lands and reclaim everything that they could find. It was a great martial time, but it also meant that the interior of the Imperium became less defended, and so there was a rise in external conflicts, such as those of the chaos tainted and the Xenos minded. It came and tried to usurp the human empire in its weakened state. However, they managed to fend off these incursions and allowed humanity to continue in its Imperium. Some of the notable events in the Age of Redemption include the Great Cull, when the High Lords of Terra began to destroy a large number of worlds that they considered to have fallen to heresy during the Age of Apostasy. They also had the Abyssal Crusade, where Saint Bersalius ordered that 30 Space Marine legions had become corrupted and must repent. Thus, those chapters actually set out on a repentance crusade into the Eye of Terror to purge the worlds that had been tainted during the birth of Slaanesh. It was also in this period that several of the Black Crusades took place, launched by Ezekiel Abaddon and his Black Legion, although that will be mainly mentioned in the history of Chaos coming later. Now, the later period after the Age of Redemption is the waning. This is a period when mankind began to suffer because of their overextension of military forces. Orc invasions, chaos invasions, cultists, Xenos. It was a relatively disruptive time. And many of the main big crusades that we know of today, such as the Gothic War, the Damocles Crusade, many of the battles, all took place in this period. After the Age of Waning came the Time of Ending. Now, this is the current period which the Imperium is in, and despite the fact it's got a rather negative connotations, there is a reason for its existence. It began in roughly this 750th century of the 41st millennium, and it was directly after the first encounter of the Tyranids that this name became widely used. It was first coined by a man named Tagarth, a seer who predicted that a great period of upheaval was coming for the Imperium, and mankind could be completely destroyed by the encroaching darkness. He was later executed for heresy, but when the Tyranids were later found and were beginning to encroach upon the galactic east, it was discovered that this time might in fact be the time of ending. It was not only the Tyranids that people feared, but also the rise of the Necrons, a greater resurgence of enemies such as the Dark Eldar, an uprising of Orcs, and the thrusts of many Chaos Crusades led many to believe that this was the end times and that it would soon be a final battle between the Imperium and the enemy forces, and which would decide either the Imperium's continued existence or fading into complete obscurity. Well, that's the end of our histories. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. We will be doing, of course, more detailed events, including the Horus Heresy, the Great Crusade, and some of the smaller crusades and events such as the Badab War and the Sabbath Crusades, to tailor to everyone. And if you have a specific event you want to be chronicled, let me know and I can do it for you. Of course, there will be other events, such as the histories of other races coming, but first we will be starting with the history and organisation of the Space Marine Legions, which will occur next week. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our video, and I hope to see you again soon.
See you next time on Vaults of Terra!